following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back talking ball in the zone. I'm Ralph Tyko of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I've got the usual suspects, as Al Blumkin said. 4 of my panelists are here. Hal Bock is here. How are you,
yes,
sir?
Yes, I am. I'm here.
All right. David Hubler.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, David. Al Blumkin.
Hello there, everybody.
Oh, good. You're in good voice, Al. Nice and deep. I'm going to ask the 4th panelist, George Case III, to tell us, our audience, and we here on the panel, what it's like for a baseball player to be traded, not just on the field stuff, but how does it affect the family? And you were the son of a ball player, George Case Jr., who was traded later on in his career, and you're old enough to remember that. Am I correct, George Case?
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. Yeah, the subject of trades really has an effect on families. It's something people might not think about, just like the military. I mean, military, they're relocating all the time. It's tough on the families. And in sports, a trade is very difficult, especially on the wives and the children. They have to pick up roots in many instances. In my situation with my dad, I was a little bit fortunate because my dad was traded in the end of the 45 season. Mr. Griffith traded him to Cleveland. He was looking for power. My dad was one of Clark Griffith's favorite players, and my father, had great speed and was a tremendous leadoff hitter, but was not a power hitter at all. So Mr. Griffith was looking for power, and he traded to Cleveland for Jeff Heath, who was a left-handed hitter. Unfortunately, the trade didn't work out because Jeff only hit a couple home runs at Griffith Stadium and then was traded himself to, I believe, the St. Louis Browns. So the thing about my dad, and then he was traded back to Washington after the 46 season in exchange for Roger Wolf. Wolf had been a 20-game winner in 45 and had a tremendous year and probably had a high market value. 46 he slumped, and my dad had been injured as well. So both of them were sort of like damaged goods going into the 47 season. So their value to the teams had diminished greatly. But Mr. Griffith did say to my dad when he got him, when he told him he was bringing him back to Washington, he said, "George, I'm bringing you home." And that was a really wonderful gesture on his part, because the only year my dad had not played in the major leagues was in 46 in Cleveland. So, that's basically what was going on. Now, as far as the off-the-field situation, my mother and father were fortunate because they built a home in Pennsylvania in 1941 when I was just a year old. Always kept it. During baseball season, if it was in Washington, they rented. In 46, they rented in Cleveland. We lived in Shaker Heights. So it was always during baseball season, we weren't, in the Pennsylvania area. But after the season, we would come right back to Pennsylvania because that was our permanent home. So, I was fortunate because I was brought up in a family that was surrounded by family, and my friends and schoolmates and everything, knew my dad, of course, was a ball player, but we weren't subjected to the travail, really, of having to pick up roots and find a new location, a new school system, and all that kind of thing. So that's a very difficult thing. My mother was able to, maintain a wonderful household, and, she supported my dad whenever, he was playing, because his hours and and the years that he was playing were certainly a lot different than the average person. But on the other hand, we had a family home that we could always come back to at the end of the baseball season, and that's what we did. So that, in essence, is my story with regard to trades. And I can tell you for a fact, if we had to pick up roots and go elsewhere, I would not have been happy. I was only 6 years old when my dad was in Cleveland, and I remember things because, that was important at that age to start to realize that your father is doing something a little bit different. But on the other hand, I had a childhood that I felt was terrific because my friends and my home was in Pennsylvania, and I always knew at the end of baseball season that's where we were going to be. So that's my story, and I'd love to talk to anybody about their comments with trades because, trades are a really big part of baseball.
George?
Alan, go ahead.
Okay, there was a left-handed pitcher in the 50s by the name of Dick Littlefield who was traded, I think, 10 times, including the time he was traded from the Giants to the Dodgers for Jackie Robinson, and then when Robinson retired, that was canceled. And then the Giants were so thrilled that 2 months later they sent him to the Cubs. And this guy was traded 2 times. He was traded twice within like a month. I mean, what do you think somebody like that had to live like?
Yeah, I think, Alan, that's really interesting. There's been some other trades, like Bobo Newsom, a teammate of my dad. I mean, he was traded, I don't know how many times, 10, 12, who knows how many times. He had a 20-year career, and I think he played with like 10 different teams. So, trades are something that if it were me, it would be very difficult for a family. Now, maybe Littlefield didn't have a family. I really don't know. But if you have youngsters or your wife and you've got to try to be looking for a new place to live, it's very tough. And then in his situation, I mean, my gosh, a month later you get traded again. So, that's not an ideal situation. And it's got to be very difficult for a ball player to go through that. And obviously it's got to be a tremendous burden on the family if they have a family. And also, trades can be something that, you can be traded and not be a good fit. That happens a lot of times. There are trades that are called off, or there are trades that happen and the players are very unhappy. And, all of a sudden you say, hey, maybe we're not even going to do this trade. So, Alan, I understand what you're talking about, but from my point of view, I was fortunate because I didn't have to go through with that.
One of the things that made the trades in your dad's era and today different. When he was playing, it was almost like going to the office for 9 to 5. They were all day games. Now they're all night games. So as a family unit, you're home in the morning and then you got to pick yourself up. Most of the ball players get to the park around 1:30 for a 7 o'clock game. So it really disrupts the whole family cycle. Your dad must have gotten home, maybe 5, 6 o'clock in the evening from a game here in D.C.?
Yeah, David, you're absolutely right. You're making a good point because, ball players back then, by and large, all the games were day games. So, they would go to a ballpark, say it was a 2 o'clock game or whatever it is. They go to a ballpark 10 o'clock in the morning for, batting practice and an infield practice thing. Play their game, and then after the game, a 2-hour game, 4 or 5 o'clock, they're ready to head back home. Today you've got night games that are, 5, 6 hours long, and sometimes they're being played if they're extra innings, they're being played after midnight. So they definitely disrupt the players' biological clock, and the families make it very, very difficult for them. If you have a youngster, say, hey, where's my daddy? He's on the road, or he'll be home, but he's going to be home after you're asleep. So, it's a very, very difficult problem for ball players. And one other thing I'd just like to mention is, and maybe Hal and Alan and David and Ralph, you can talk further about it, but back then, trades were really made. Players were playing, with 1-year contracts. So there was no free agency. The reserve clause was in effect. So you accepted the trade, and sometimes the trades worked out, sometimes they didn't. But today, with free agency and the huge amount of money being spent, a player today will opt out of his contract or play, his final year of free agency, and then he'll go somewhere else. And he's not being traded. He's being picked up by another ball club who wants his services, but at that, outrageously high price that they have to pay today, where in the past the players had that 1-year contract, and that basically was it.
In your dad's day, trades were made based on need for a team and ability. Right. Today, many trades are made based on how much is that guy making, what's his contract, and matching contracts. So that if I trade a player who's making $2 million a year, I don't want to get back a player who's making $6 million a year. I want to keep my payroll intact. So it's less a question of the ability of the players involved than it is the contracts involved. That's a major change in baseball from the time your dad played.
Yeah, well, Hal, you're absolutely right about that. And of course, back then in Washington, I'm not sure about the other clubs because I'm not really conversant about how they ran their organizations. But in the case of the Senators, Clark Griffith was the owner, and he was the owner, and he negotiated the contracts, and the players, worked with him, and he negotiated trades. They didn't even have a general manager. Now, some of the deeper pocket clubs had their general managers, but in the case of Washington, they did, and also the Philadelphia A's. Connie Mack, traded his 4 superstars that he had in that 29 to 31 era that the A's dominated. He needed the money, and so he negotiated the trades for a player, and the player, whether he performed or not. But the fact is that Mr. Mack was able to get a tremendous amount of income, which he needed, in lieu of the services of the player that he went ahead. I'm talking about like Lefty Grove and Mickey Cochran, Al Simmons, Jimmy Fox. Mr. Mack, he had to sell, trade all of them to bring some money into his pocket. And
one of the big problems that Connie Mack had with that team is that Pennsylvania did not allow Sunday ball until 1934.
Right. Well, that's another issue. Some of those so-called blue laws, they certainly had an effect. And there were also, games that were, I don't think a game was allowed to start after midnight or something like that.
7 o'clock.
Right.
Sunday they could go past 7 o'clock.
Right, a very similar situation, Alan. I mentioned about Connie Mack, very similar with Clark Griffith. Clark Griffith traded his son-in-law, who had brought a pennant to Washington in 1933. At the end of the 34 season, he trades Joe Cronin to the Red Sox for a very obscure player named Lynn Larry, but the kicker was $250,000 went into the Washington till. So that's another issue back then that, if a trade could happen that was good for the team financially, that trade, could possibly be made. And Griffith and Connie Mack, both of them, did that quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
Branch Rickey. Branch Rickey, when he was running both the Cardinals and Dodgers, sold his excess talent to all sorts of teams. When he was at the Dodgers, he sold numerous players who couldn't be out, Hodges or Reese or Ferraro or Snyder, to the Cubs. And
that's what I was saying about when the Red Sox sold Babe Ruth to the Yankees. It was strictly a money deal. They needed money.
Right.
And
in my imagination, and I'd ask all of you guys this question, but it seems to me that in this era of free agency, there are a lot fewer trades than there once were. It just seems to me that most deals with players moving from team to team are free agent signings. Do you get the same impression? I wonder if you guys get the same impression.
Well, you know what, Hal, it's interesting you brought that up. I was thinking about that today. And I don't have any, data to back it up, but I was just thinking to myself, trades back when I recall, and in the 50s and 60s, trades were exactly that. There was no such thing as free agency. Now, there were certain trades that were talked about that were called off. The one most famous one, whether it was ever just, alcohol fueled, but it was DiMaggio for Williams. And there's an example where, who knows if that trade had ever happened. It never did, but if it ever happened, I mean, my God, how many home runs would Joe DiMaggio hit at Fenway? At Fenway with a Green Monster, and how many home runs would Ted Williams have hit in New York with that short porch, right field? So, those things happen, and there was also that Frank Lane with his nickname Trader Lane, and when he was the GM at Cleveland, I mean, he traded Rocky Colavito, who was legendary, to Detroit in exchange for Harvey Keene. And so, those kind of trades happen. But, Hal, you're absolutely right. There was no free agency involved at that time. It was going to be a swap of players or talent or a need or whatever they wanted to do. And also if they were going to be able to, bring some money into their till.
Also, in those days, the June 15th was the trading deadline during the season, not July 31st, the way it is now.
Right.
When Leo DeRocha became manager of the Giants in 1949, he decided that the Giants needed some speed and they needed to get rid of some of the heavy-footed players that he had. So he packaged a trade. He made a trade with the Boston Braves. He got Alvin Dark and Eddie Stanky, a second base shortstop combination, to play the infield, to play the middle of the infield, and he shipped some of my favorite players, Willard Marshall, and a right fielder, and Sid Gordon, third baseman, and Buddy Kerr, I think, was in that trade.
Yeah.
And Sam Webb, a pitcher. He traded 4 players to get the 2 players that he really needed and wanted. And the next thing you know, the Giants won the pennant in 1951.
That trade also was the first step in driving the Braves out of Boston. It was so damaging to them.
Well, trades sometimes don't work out,
Well, Lane, when he went to, when Lane was made general manager of the White Sox, within a period of 2 or 3 years, he got Billy Pierce for a backup catcher named Aaron Robinson. He got Nellie from Detroit. He got Nellie Fox from the A's for a backup catcher named Joe Tipton. And then in the 3-team trade in early 1951, he got Minnie Minoso from the Indians. But the problem with Lane is he got to the point where the longer he stayed in the place, the more he couldn't stand players who got more publicity than him. There's a book that came out a couple of years ago on him, which I'll recommend, called Frantic Frankie Lane. And that's because Colavito got more popular than Frank Lane. He traded him, and he broke up that team that almost won the pennant in 1959.
Well, what was intriguing about that trade, he traded Colavito to Detroit for Harvey Keene.
Yeah.
And these were 2 superstar players at the time. And the trade was a slugger, Colavito, for a guy who was not a slugger, who was an average hitter, a high average hitter in Harvey Keene. Now, that's the kind of trade that Lane liked to make. It was one that would generate a lot of conversation, and he was one for conversation. Another one I wanted to point out, when Bill Veeck was out of baseball for a few years because the owners couldn't take his act, he sent up a midget to bat for the St. Louis Browns one day in 1951, and eventually he drifted out of baseball, and he came back. He came back in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And he came back right before the winter meetings in Florida, and he set up a table in the lobby of the hotel, and a sign that said "Open for Business," which meant he'd trade anybody and everybody. I guess it was with the White Sox at the time.
Yeah,
that sounds like Beck. You know?
He came back once, just at the same time that free agency was coming into existence, and he couldn't afford to hold on to certain players, and he made a very prophetic statement. He says after free agency started, it's not going to be the cost of stardom, it's going to be the cost of mediocrity.
Well, you know what Charlie Finley's idea
Alan, that's interesting because, today when you look at it, and this is off the subject a little bit, but when you look at the salaries and they're being paid today, when you're talking about mediocrity, I mean, what is it? The $550,000 is the minimum starting salary for a player who hasn't proven himself in the first game yet. So, if he's called up to the majors, and with free agency, it's a different world. The guys' contracts, and I've always said I don't fault the players. If somebody wants to pay them that kind of money, then by God, where do I sign?
There's a picture.
It is a different world today.
Yeah, it's not only that. It's not only free agency. It's the union, the ball players' union.
Right.
There was no union back in the 40s.
Right. Yeah, David, they did. That's another good point. My dad, he retired in 47. It was retroactive back to 46 as far as the pension was concerned for ball players. So anybody who retired before 46, no matter who you were, you didn't get one dime in pension. And the players' union was very adamant about that. I know my dad, that was when the players' union really was first getting underway, but he got good advice. They said, hey, George, don't retire in 46, retire in 47, because we're going to make it retroactive to anybody who was on a roster in 46.
Whoa, so he hung on one more year.
Right.
You know what Charlie Finley wanted to do? Charlie Finley was a genius. I mean, they made fun of him for some of his crackpot ideas, but he really knew the game, and he knew what was going on in terms of the finances of the game. And when he saw free agency coming in, and he knew there would be bidding wars, for example, Reggie Jackson, he was offered what they described as a king's ransom. Well, Charlie Finley came up with an idea. He said, let's make them all free agents every year. Everybody is a free agent. And he figured that would reduce the bidding war for the individual stars. That, of course, never happened. But Charlie tried to trade or tried to get rid of some of his stars who were going to become free agents. And Bowie Kuhn stepped in, the commissioner, and said, you can't do that because you're stripping the franchise, which he was doing, and he didn't care much about that. He had already won his pennants, and he was happy with them. So Charlie was an innovative guy, and he had that idea about making everybody a free agent, and that would reduce the bidding wars. And I pointed out that Reggie Jackson was offered what was described to me as a king's ransom, and when he signed for $3,750,000 for 5 years with the Yankees. Well, that's chump change in this environment, in this generation. But Reggie played when he played,
Well, Jim Bouton wrote that he had a season in 1963 when he won 21-7, and he wanted $20,000 for the salary in 1964, and Ralph Houck was the Yankee GM at the time and wouldn't give it to him. So Bouton held out, and Houck started fining him $500 a day for any time missed in spring training. And I think they finally settled on something like $18,000. But Bouton was very bitter about that. And Ralph, some of the players that we've done podcasts with, and they're not fond. The old players are not fond of management generally.
Oh no, of course not. Management held the axe at the time. There was no. They could back you up in the minor leagues as they did, as Cincinnati, I think it was, did was the Yankees did with Hank Sauer. Hank Sauer was coming up behind Lou Gehrig. They backed him up. They traded him to Cincinnati, and he was backed up at Cincinnati by Kluszewski or whoever, and it took him till he was 26, 27 to become a regular, and then he became a slugger. So management had the hammer, and free agency, the good, bad, and the ugly, you got to treat people like human beings. And if people are not given a fair opportunity, is all you want.
Well, the only time the owners really had to back down was when the American League was formed in 1901, and tons of National Leaguers jumped to the American League because of the salary restrictions in the National League. And the second time was when the Federal League came into existence for 2 years, and they gave out the owners gave out huge contracts to keep the stars from going over there. In fact, Eddie Collins was signed to a big contract by Connie Mack, which he carried over to Chicago when he was sent there, and that's one of the reasons the Black Sox players hated him.
Ah, okay. Hey, guys, let's go around the room. I want to start with David, and you come up with an interesting trade from your standpoint, good, bad, or indifferent, that the Yankees made. You were a Yankee fan growing up, and anything blow you away for the good or the bad? David Hubler.
Oh, well, the one that I was thinking when you were talking about it was but it wasn't really a trade. At one point, they were trying to the Reggie Jackson deal. That was kind of strange in the way it was formed, because there was talk of Jackson when Finley was dumping the team. Jackson was one of them that was going to go, and he and several other players the Yankees had their eyes on, and then of course the whole thing was called off, and eventually Jackson did get to the Yankees. But you talk about trades and stuff. I mean, Jackson, he had 1 year in Baltimore. He had played out on the West Coast. He played 1 year with Baltimore, and then he jumped, if you want to call it that, to the Yankees, and then he went back to he was a much-traveled all-star, a terrific ball player, and you wonder, what went on behind the scenes? What made him move so many times? And there are a couple of other players I can't think of offhand who were really disliked and were traded because they were disliked and they were poison in the clubhouse.
Well, the player that a lot of people think of along those lines was Bobby Bonds, not Barry, but Bobby. And he was traded 6 or 7 different times in his career. And as talented a guy as he was, you would wonder why. And they asked him once, why were you traded so much? And Bobby Bonds said, why don't you ask me why I was traded for so much? So, one man's poison is another man's feast, that kind of thing.
I once asked Bobby Bonds that question. We were in the spring training, and he was with the Cardinals at the time. And I said to him, how come you get traded so often? And he looked at me. I thought he's going to kill me, which he might have. He looked at me and he said, why don't you ask him? And he pointed to the general manager of the Cardinals. So I just moved on to another story.
Right. All right, Mr. Bonds. Have a nice day, sir.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And to keep coming back, you have to be. I'm asking you in particular for confirmation on this. As a sports writer dealing with these people, a lot of it is avoiding confrontations and keeping the lines of communication open so you get what you get, even if you know it's not much.
Well, it's access. You need access as a sports writer, and so you try not to offend anybody, but sometimes you offend guys for no particular reason because they feel like being offended. I had a lot of experiences like that.
One of your colleagues on the New York Post used to get into it with Billy Martin quite often.
Henry Hecht. That was that was easy to do.
My former
Billy
camper,
had a
by the way.
chip on his shoulder.
Oh yeah. Did you know he was one of my campers in summer camp?
I knew that. I don't know if
no.
I don't know how he was he was a miserable kid. He was so angry the whole 8 weeks. In fact, when his parents came up on the last day, when the councils get their money, they get their tips, he made sure his parents did not give me a nickel. He went into a fit.
He didn't like you, huh?
He didn't like anybody, and nobody liked him. And that was at 12 years old.
Yeah.
Character stays with you. But I remember reading several articles about how he got into it, Billy Martin. That's the last person you want to fight with is Billy Martin.
Well, Billy had issues. Much of it traced to alcohol.
Yeah.
But he also had other issues. He was, in my opinion, he was a racist and he was an anti-Semite. But other than that, he was a good fellow.
Other than that, right? Yes.
He's a good guy. Yeah.
So he did not like Henry because Henry was Jewish, and he did not like Reggie Jackson because Reggie was black. So I mean, he had issues, with his players and with the writers. I never got into it with Billy Martin deliberately because I didn't want to make my life miserable,
Sure.
So I tried to tread lightly when I had to deal with him.
Well, the Dodgers all hated Dick Young when they figured he became a stooge for Walter O'Malley.
Well, they called him Poison Pen.
Yeah.
The players called him Poison Pen.
And years later, Poison Pen ran Tom Seaver out of town.
Yeah, also when I was we used to put a group together from where I worked to go to the baseball writers' dinner until the admission got out of hand. And there's one time Dick Young was there, came in, and Keith Hernandez got up and walked out.
Okay.
Wow.
All right.
But he was the first guy, Dick Young, if I'm not mistaken, that would go into a clubhouse after the game.
Yeah.
You're right about that?
That's true. That is 100% true.
He revolutionized
the craft. He certainly did. He certainly did. Because when he did that, he had stuff that the other writers didn't have. And that was not going to sit well with the other writers. They had to match him. And so he was a trendsetter in that respect.
And he was the guy that when you bought the Daily News for 3 cents, you opened it back first and went right to his column.
Absolutely. Young ideas.
Right. Yeah. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he wrote for the Sporting News with the same byline.
Probably, yeah. Probably.
Yeah.
One point I wanted to make earlier, and I know that George will back me up on this when we were talking about owners acting as their own general managers and and trying to squeeze out the last nickel. That was a charge against Griffith, but he was really good to his players, even though he couldn't pay them very much. He really had a feeling for them, like as he did with your dad, George. He liked his ball players, and he really tried to help them when he could.
Yeah, he did, David. He did. I back you up 100% on that. My dad, I've mentioned many times, he loved Mr. Griffith. He used to get in. I've got letters when they're going back and forth. Whether my dad was going to hold out and all that kind of stuff. But Mr. Griffith supported him. One time, I think it was in '42, my dad had his tonsils out, and Mr. Griffith didn't have enough money to drive his car because of rationing. I wrote my dad a nice letter saying, George, I hope everything's all right with your health. I'm really counting on you and thinking about you and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it was something that was part of his nature, and the players respected him, and they really, I never heard anybody talk down about Mr. Griffith because they realized the financial situation he was in, and he did the best he could do with the limited resources that he had.
Yeah, George, I'm sorry, I just thought of this. How many of you have read Boys of Summer?
Right, yeah.
I read
it.
Okay, the first one of the chapters in there is on Clem Labine, the pitcher, who had a son that had a leg shot off in Vietnam. And then he discussed, interviews the players, years after they played, and writes chapters. He says Labine the son was distant because Labine was away so much. And Labine really regretted that they made up at the end, but he really regretted the fact that that his children seemed so distant from him because of what he did for a living.
Not the case that was not the case in the Case family. From listening to George for 3 years, I can assure you there was no separation anxiety. You knew he was coming back, and your mom filled the foundation just fine. Am I correct, George?
Ralph, you're right. I mean, she did, and I was fortunate again because it was a loving family. But I knew at the end, on the flip side of that, at the end of baseball season, I knew my dad was going to be home, every night. And, for the next 3 or 4 months, he was going to tuck me into bed and we'd talk and all that kind of stuff. And because my dad, his job at the end of baseball season was over and it wouldn't begin again until the next baseball season. And if he was working in a defense industry plant, he was there for 9 to 5 or whatever it was, just like, regular mom and regular father. And so, I was fortunate because I had that to go into after baseball season. I knew my dad was going to be home.
Did he work? I know he worked in the defense industry during the war, but I know, and many ball players had to get another job when the season ended.
Right.
Did he work in the off season?
Well, what he did, David, he opened up a sporting goods store. The year he retired, his half brother had helped him financially to come up with the money to open up a store. So that's what my dad did. And then all the years that he was coaching baseball at Rutgers, he had a sporting goods store as well. And then he sold the store when he went back into baseball in '61. So, he was used to working, but baseball was his livelihood, and that's what he did. And he started in 1936 was his first professional contract, and played until 47. So his was a rather short career, but on the other hand, it was a solid career, and I benefited because I had my mom and dad and created a family situation at home and in an area where we were surrounded also by other family members. So, I wasn't a stranger in my own neighborhood. I was part of the neighborhood, and I really appreciated that.
And you were lucky, too, because when your dad was traded to Cleveland, you almost were like equidistant between Washington. I mean, I've driven that so many times out to Cleveland and Columbus. So, I mean, Pennsylvania is like right there in the middle between them.
Yeah, well, you're right. I was only 6 years old at the time, so I'm not sure how my dad and mother handled it, but we did have a home in Shaker Heights that was there during the baseball season. Just like when my dad was playing in Washington, each year we rented a home during baseball season. So we knew we were going to come back to Pennsylvania at the end of the season, and I always looked forward to it because I'd see my friends again.
So you didn't have to switch schools?
Never switched schools. I was in the same school system from the time I was in first grade to my senior year. Never switched schools.
George, I wanted to mention one other thing, too, that the year or two your dad was in Cleveland, he developed some lifetime friendships that he wouldn't have developed were he not traded? And an example of that was Early Wynn. Am I correct?
Yeah, Early Wynn. Yeah, Early Wynn and my dad were teammates in Washington, and then when Early went to Cleveland, and Bob Feller, Bob Lemon, Jim Hagan, they all became very good friends, and of course my dad was very close with Bill Veeck as well, because Veeck arranged. I
forgot that Early Wynn played with Washington.
Well, he did, but he didn't do very well because the team didn't do well. But Early Wynn wound up being a 300-game winner, and pitched with Cleveland and with the White Sox. But my dad and Early used to compare notes, obviously, about Cleveland, and some of Early's best years as a major league pitcher were with the Indians when he had that tremendous pitching staff that the Indians had. And the other part of that was that Bob Lemon, and I've mentioned this before, Hall of Famer, great pitcher. Bob Lemon started in Cleveland in 1946 as the starting center fielder. My dad was in left,
right.
Lemon was in center, and the other player in right field made the three of them. But then Mel Harder had convinced Lou Boudreau to turn Bob Lemon into a starting pitcher, which he did, and Lemon went on to a future Hall of Fame career.
Whoa. Okay, guys, I'm going to wrap it up by giving a bibliography. It's called The Baseball Trade Register. It's edited by Joseph Reichler. Every trade, sale, and free agent signing from 1900 on. I keep this at the foot of my desk. It is a constant reference, has been for years for me. Incredible reference book, and there you go.
Do they update it all the time? Do they update it?
The one I have, I don't know if they've continued to update it because of the influxion of the internet. Let's see if I can quickly come up with the year this was published.
It probably goes until the mid-'60s or thereabouts.
No, sadly, it's only 1984. And you said that tongue-in-cheek, but isn't that the truth with printed literature?
Yeah.
But it goes back all the way. So we bemoan the death of the written word on paper. Let's face it. It's how many. I'll bet all of you guys get a daily newspaper. Am I correct?
I do. I absolutely do. And I'll tell you one quick thing. I once won a complete set of the Encyclopedia Britannica, only it was the 1911 edition, and it listed every flight that had ever been made.
Wow.
Shows you how quickly things go out of style.
Absolutely. You remember the World Almanac?
Yes,
right,
they still put that out every year.
Every year.
Yeah, I got it after the major election years.
Please.
Yeah.
With information, please.
That's no longer around, but the World Almanac is. And I used to get the sporting news, when it was all baseball, way back when, I looked forward to it every week for a quarter or half a dollar, whatever it was, and then they.
You guys are awfully old,
Yeah, I know.
We're working on that time machine, though.
Yeah.
We'll be young when we get to go back.
That's good. That's good. Let me know.
I will.
Yeah, we'll all like to go with you, Ralph. Believe me.
Yes, sir.
Well, if you guys come up with one before me, on the off chance that you do, let me know.
I sure will.
All right, guys. Come back next week, healthy and happy. And thank you for listening. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. We had Hal Bock, David Hubler, George Case III, and Alan Blumkin. This was a good one, guys. Thank you again.
Yep.
Thank
Good night,
you all.
everybody. I enjoyed it. Yep. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
The proceeding has been a comfortably zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.